This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host, Josh, and with us is your other host, Puka.
Greetings.
What are we talking about today, Puka?
Well, by popular demand, or maybe it wasn't very popular demand, it was just a demand that somebody made. It might have been me. Anyway, we're
I think
talking
it was
about...
you.
Probably. Well, we're talking about books, and in particular, books that are inspirational for Changeling games, and players, and storytellers. So this is primarily a list of our own beloved books, but with a couple suggestions from our listeners that we'll be talking about.
Okay, so yeah, we're going through, would you like to start us off?
I shall. I'm gonna go alphabetically by the name of the author for my particular picks. And I'm
I am
essentially...
not.
That's
For
fine.
mine.
So I'll read the blurb that's on the back cover of the edition that I have, and then explain why I love this book and why I think it's good for Changeling. So, the first one is War for the Oaks by Emma Bull, which I believe came out in 1987, something like that. And the blurb is, Eddie McAndry sings rock and roll, but her boyfriend just dumped her band just broke up, and life could hardly be worse. Then, walking home through downtown Minneapolis on a dark night, she finds herself drafted into an invisible war between the fairy folk. Now, more than her own survival is at risk, and her own preferences, musical and personal, are very much beside the point. By turns tough and lyrical, fabulous and down to earth, War for the Oaks is a fantasy novel that's as much about this world as about the other one. It's about real love and loyalty, about real music and musicians, about false glamour and true art. It will change the way you hear and see your own daily life. All 100% true. I love this book. I first read it as a teenager. I think I had already been playing Changeling by that point. But I remember I have a very keen memory of reading it on a family vacation in the mountains of Massachusetts. And it's very much a down-to-earth urban fantasy, late 80s kind of vibe. They talk about Prince a lot because they're musicians in Minneapolis. Boiled in Lead is like a cameo in there. But it's very much from a dreamer's perspective. So Eddie McAndry is this musician, and she gets tapped by the Sealy court, essentially, of Minneapolis to kind of be their proxy human in their fight. Because in the rules of the novel universe, Fae can only harm each other when there's a mortal present. Something about their presence, I guess in Changeling terms, brings the autumn in and makes it possible for them to injure each other. And it's kind of these pitched battles between the courts. So she gets drawn into this and kind of doesn't really want to be involved, but then the Unseelie are going to try to like assassinate her, so she has to be protected. And her protector, of course, is a character named Puka. So I appreciate that. Spelled differently though. But it's fun, it's witty, it's gritty, which I like. I want Changeling games and World of Darkness games to be gritty. It's well paced, it keeps moving, and you keep turning pages. The description is beautiful. And it's just one of my favorite novels. I really would recommend it to anybody, not just Changeling fans. So, that's my spiel.
Excellent. My first pick is a book series. Maybe the first one might be the most Changeling inspiration, but they're all 15 books in the series. I thought there was 16, but I have to pre-order one. It's coming out in September. It's the October Day series by Shannon McGuire. First book is Rosemary and Rue. I found out about this book when became very disenchanted with a author of a book about a modern day wizard, and I was asking for other series, and somebody recommended this one. It's about started out being about a changeling private detective in San Francisco. She's more human than Fae, gets into trouble. I don't really want to spoil things too much because there's a lot of reveals. It's very much it's like the hard-boiled detective, and she's getting like hit in the head a lot and things like that. But there's a reason that she doesn't get long-term brain damage from that. and yeah, ends up having all sorts of horrible things happen to her, but also learns lots of things, and it's a really fun ride. I like Shannon Regard. Shannon Regard is another series too that's good, but this is the very much the Changeling one, the October Day series, and it's set in San Francisco. And after when I was reading through the toy box, I'm like, oh, she must have read the toy box as well. So you could take this as chronicle ideas for your San Francisco game. Is a lot of these books, including the local fairy nobility living in the same, having their what they're called no's in this book, but they're or in this series, but they're basically freeholds. And it's I really like the book. The other series that I really like of hers is the Encryptids, but that's more of a mage or in Hunter's Innocence book if you had to pick a World of Darkness connection. But yeah, so October Day series, very good.
I haven't read it, but from my limited sort of browsing online, it definitely seems like well suited for an ongoing chronicle because there are so many, well,
Yeah,
there's so many novels, and I assume each one is kind of an individual story in her adventures that
yeah.
could kind of, yeah,
She's branching out to other characters in the world. I think because in game terms, this character has way too much XP by book 15.
that
But
happens.
yeah. So what's your next book, Fuka?
So the next one is Little Big by John Crowley. And the blurb is John Crowley's masterful Little Big is the epic story of Smoky Barnable, an anonymous young man who travels by foot from the city, capital C, to a place called Edgewood, not found on any map, to marry Daily Alice Drinkwater, as was prophesied. It is the story of 4 generations of a singular family living in a house that is many houses on the magical border of an otherworld. It is a story of fantastic love and heartrending loss, of impossible things and unshakable destinies, and of the great tale, capital T, that envelops us all. It is a wonder. So, this book, I don't know if you've read, have you read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez?
No, I have not.
All right. It's kind of like that, but with Kinane. It is very much a Kinane book. So, you know you're getting into something serious when you get the table of contents. It is a very long book, just also. Well, not too long. It's like 500 pages, but after the table of contents, you get a family tree of characters who you'll have to keep track of through the narrative. It's very helpful to have this. So, I'd like to also read the opening 2 sentences as well because I think they give some context, if that's all right.
That's totally fine.
So it's on a certain day in June 19 blank, a young man was making his way on foot northward from the great city to a town or place called Edgewood that he had been told of but had never visited. His name was Smoky Barnable, and he was going to Edgewood to get married. The fact that he walked and didn't ride was one of the conditions placed on his coming there at all. And that kind of sets the tone for throughout the book. There are sort of peculiar rules and traditions and circumstances and mysterious things that happen to and around this family. And it becomes clear over the course of learning more about their history and flashbacks and past narratives and dreams that they are in some way Fae touched. There has been some kind of intermarriage and mingling of Fae blood and human blood that has affected each of them in different ways. And that really is explored very thoroughly, kind of the idea of what would that do to a family. So if you had any desire to kind of explore Kinane in a changeling game in a deep way, this is absolutely the book to do it, because it's very much a family epic, like any novel of that sort. It gets really deep into the relationships between the siblings and the parents and children and the grandparents and children, and then the family as a whole is kind of removed from society in different ways and how that affects them. They have this one distant cousin who's also a really good example of either a sorcerer or a low arete mage, so that's kind of a nice touch. There's also some stuff about the dichotomy between, I guess you could call it, the banality of the city and the glamour of the wilderness, and how either one can be highly dangerous to mortals. So the Fae are minimally present. They're very uncanny. It's unclear whether they're actually Fae or something else, but they're kind of on the fringes and you don't get a direct look at them, which I also really like. So I actually read this book for a class in college, which I'm very happy about. Like the fact that this was assigned reading was pretty awesome. And I believe also, so this book, it won the World Fantasy Award, but also sort of famously, Harold Bloom, love him or hate him, probably the latter for most people, he included it in his canon of Western literature. And I think it was like the only fantasy novel because it's almost a fantasy novel in name only. Just there's that veneer of fairiness. And aside from that, it's this epic like you'd get from, I don't know, John Steinbeck or something. So, or William Faulkner maybe is a better comparison. That sort of uncanny gothic element. But beautifully, beautifully written, really well developed characters. You really get a sense of them as people. And it's just very, very changeling to me. And then what's the next one for you?
So this next one, actually, I'd say the main character is also very Kinane. It's Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town by Cory Doctorow. This is the first book of his I ever read, and it's very different from a lot of his other books, but he sort of turned more into a science fiction author. But I'll give you the plot summary here. Alan is a middle aged entrepreneur in contemporary Toronto who has devoted himself to fixing up a house in a bohemian neighborhood. This naturally brings him to contact with a house full of students and layabouts next door, including a young woman who, in a moment of stress, reveals to him that she has wings. Wings, moreover, that grow back after each attempt to cut them off. Alan understands. He himself has a secret or two. His father is a mountain, his mother is a washing machine, and among his brothers are a set of Russian nesting dolls.
Nice.
So this is set in Toronto, somewhere between urban fantasy and sort of magical realism. I don't know. It's like the two met. A lot of the plot's about him trying to set up this mesh network internet for everyone to have free internet, basically, and community activism focused. But there's also, dealing with his family that's makes no sense for him. It's like he's an anime kinane. But yeah, like in Alan himself is it's like he's a Kinane with none of those powers, just able to interact with the really weird world. And if not a normal person, but like I've definitely met, you could meet people like him. He doesn't. There's no powers. There's no whatever, but he's able to. He's like navigating this very messed up supernatural world, and he's very experienced at it, even if he's not liking it. And it's just it's interesting things about like that sort of dealing with the mortal world and trying to accomplish things there versus a very strange and demanding supernatural world. And so it's another Kinane book, but this one's much more what it's like to be a Kinane when the dreaming Fey world family won't leave you alone.
The washing machine is a wonderful touch.
Yeah, and you get to meet his mom stuff. His father doesn't talk much. It's mostly
Mm.
his brothers.
Mrs. Washing Machine.
Yeah, she's just a washing machine. Like it's apparently he popped out of it, I think.
That's wonderful. I wonder which phylum that would be.
Yeah. It's like, we need or is it that other what are they called in C20?
Lycian?
Yeah.
I
It's
don't
like
know.
his
That would have to be a pretty puissant washing machine
yeah,
to
because
inspire the
it's not a
creation of a
mannequin.
Lycian.
It's not
No,
a
no, no.
now we need to figure out we need a new type of thing in Changeling that could be a washing machine.
Well, there is so in Japanese folklore, there's the yokai, and
Hmm.
I wish they were more represented because you do get like inanimate object spirit beings. I don't know that they would quite be the same as like chimera, but
Yeah. Well, this washing machine only does things that his mother only does things that washing machines could do for the most part.
I think also most of the yokai are hostile. So a washing machine that tries to kill you would be more in line with yokai.
I- I've always read yokai as very fairy. Like a lot of fairies also try to kill you more so than they would maybe in Changeling, but
Yeah.
or at least mess with you.
Well, there's the particular class of, if I remember correctly, the particular class of the inanimate object ones are sort of like inanimate objects that you've wronged, so or possessions that you don't treat properly.
Yeah. I
So
don't
that's why
remember
they're
if they explain why she's in the cave of his father. presumably after they got married. He doesn't fill in the details because you don't need to, right? But
Right.
yeah, the nesting dolls are the most changeling like. These two are not. Yeah, his parents are not changelings, I'd say, at all.
Cool.
But yeah, it also talks about actually the whole story is also a fight against banality in a sense. But,
I feel like most urban fantasy stories are, to some extent, fights against
yep.
banality stories. But yeah. So next up for me.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was going to ask you, what's your next one? Yeah, sorry.
So, all right. So the next one, this is from an author who has numerous books that we could have selected, and maybe we'll select another one again in a future installment, which is Charles Dellint, who consistently writes sort of fae inflected, again, cross between urban fantasy, magic realism stuff. Well, more urban fantasy, I suppose. But the one that I'm going with, just because I think it's the one I'm remembering most clearly at the moment, is The Wild Wood. And so the description is: Enya is a young painter who is acclaimed by the art world until the critics start noticing that her work has lost the animating passion that had set her apart from the crowd. She returns to her cabin in Canada's remote woods, hoping to find a place where she can seek solitude and focus on her art. At first, Enya's muse remains elusive, but then beautiful and disturbing creatures start slipping into her sketches unbidden. The following days bring strange visitors bearing cryptic messages indicating that Enya may be bound by a promise made in a forgotten magical childhood. The world of fairy is clearly reaching out to her for help, and her ability to figure out what they need may mark the difference between their survival and their doom. So it's another very similar to War for the Oaks in that it's this dreamer artist who kind of gets contacted by the Fae in order to help them out with something. But it's a lot more, it's much shorter, first of all, and it's much more individual because it's really just that character and then this one mysterious figure she meets who might or may not be Fae, and then sort of the spirits of the forest as this amorphous population around her. But yeah, it's very much, it's a lot more placid. There's lots of scenes just kind of sitting in the forest, very meditative, with this growing sense of the surreal and the supernatural. This would be, I would say, a good point of reference for like, well, certainly a good point of reference for representing an enchanted human, but then also if a human found themselves slipping into the dreaming, this would be a good way to explore that. Just as she gets deeper and deeper into it, she finds herself kind of dreams are dislodging, memories are dislodging, and she's getting more and more confused, but kind of beguiled by her surroundings. So it's a quick read. It has an ending that's a little bit. Mm, I wouldn't say. I don't want to spoil it. It has an ending that's a little bit out of left field. I guess I'll say that. I'll say the way that she ends up helping the fairies is not exactly what you might expect, but it's very well written. And importantly, I think the reason why I'm also gravitating towards this one is that in the original edition, it was released as part of a series in tandem with the artwork of Brian Froud, who is, very inspirational for Changeling stuff as well, having done The Dark Crystal, having done Labyrinth, having done his fairy books, etc. So each chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, was kind of written in response to a particular painting of fairies. And the chapters are kind of named in relation to the different things they represent. So, like, there's one called The Hollow Woman, and that's based on one of the paintings. Or, let me see, there's another one called Dry Wash, which I believe is a painting technique. I'm not sure. Yeah. So, there are connections with things like Japanese culture and Zen, and then French folklore. It's kind of draws on a lot of mythic threads because Dellint does that a lot. He likes to do very cross-cultural, mythic, street level, at times, urban fantasy storytelling that deals with everyday people, usually artists. And yeah, he's a great writer. So
Yeah, I haven't read this book in particular, but I have read several of his other books, and yes, I can. I basically highly recommend anything he's written, even if I haven't read it.
Yeah,
And you know it's going to fit.
and he is a workhorse. He keeps pumping them out.
Yeah.
So
And he,
a
he
lot of
actually, I believe he still lives in my city of Ottawa.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, and I did see him play once at a local Irish pub. I don't know if I don't, definitely would have stopped during the pandemic, but I don't know how long he was, but him and his wife would play like Celtic music at the local Irish pub for once a month
Yeah.
for a while. So I've seen them play there.
There's this
Um,
little circle of authors. So Charles DeLint, Emma Bull. It's like this little. Oh, they have a name. Maybe it's the Endicott Studio is what my brain is telling me, but I'm not sure if that's right. But it's one of those little groups of authors who are all kind of know each other and write blurbs for each other's books and stuff. And a lot of their work is kind of in that vein. And I
mhm.
imagine they kind of inspire each other's characters and plot lines and stuff. So
Yeah, I'm wondering if Tanya Huff's connected to that.
potentially.
Yeah.
The Lint is also well known for doing a bunch of stories and novels set in the city of Newford, which is it's a vaguely North American city that kind of is a stand-in for, I guess, maybe Ottawa or Toronto. Well, probably Toronto because it's supposed to be pretty
It
large.
always came across as New England for me. I always pictured anything set in Newford as
Interesting.
New England. He did write a book set in Toronto that I've read.
Mm. Yeah, and not all of his books are in Newford, but it's a setting where a lot of the characters keep popping up and their narratives cross and connect, which is a nice
Mhm.
way to kind of look at, collaborative storytelling.
But yeah, Newford seemed smaller town to me.
Oh, I thought it was supposed to be like a million people.
Oh, okay. I maybe I'm thinking of something else. Anyway,
We shall investigate for the next installment of Book Inspirations. Anyway,
yes,
next up.
yeah. Next up, we have Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. So it this is a book where because of the author, it gets categorized. Well, not just because the author, it gets categorized as magical realism rather than urban fantasy. You have the main character Haroun lives with his father, and you're in this sort of very densely packed city, which is like what Changeling does sometimes. Reminds me of this is the glamorous depiction of banality. Is how I describe it. And he ends up going on what could only be described as a dreaming quest to basically save where save his city, and make everything better for everybody. He's like his family's the one family that's not all brought down essentially by the banality. And yeah, going on this, it's definitely not set in Concordia, in Changeling terms, and it's very where it would be set is another question. But it's yeah, sort of this adventure through the dreaming gets very or adventure through this other world, and yeah, I don't know. It's a hugely inspiring Changeling thing, but a different tone than a lot of the other books we'd be reading. Like we're listing for this, and I highly recommend it.
I actually still have yet to read it. I've read bits of it, and I know. I mean, I've read some of his other work that I adore. Midnight's Children is one of my favorites, but it's on my list, the ever expanding list of things to read.
Yeah, drawing upon other books that we like, classic books that would also fit with this, and yeah, I don't know how else to say. It's probably the most capital L literature book on our list, but it's amazing for this, amazing in general. So what's next?
So, another case of an author for whom we could have picked any of several books is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. And the blurb here is: under the streets of London, there's a place most people could never even dream of. A city of monsters and saints, murderers and angels, knights in armor, and pale girls in black velvet. This is the city of the people who have fallen between the cracks. Richard Mayhew, a young businessman, is going to find out more than enough about this other London. A single act of kindness catapults him out of his workday existence and into a world that is at once eerily familiar and utterly bizarre. And a strange destiny awaits him down here, beneath his native city, Neverwhere. There's also a blurb from USA Today where they describe it as the chimerical stuff of nightmare and daydream, which is pretty changeling. So,
Yep.
a lot of these novels, because they're from even the ones that deal with fairies directly or fae beings of some kind or beings that could be read as such, they are from the perspective of the human because that's just how the genre operates. So, really, I think it's good to emphasize the aspect of Changeling where changelings are human to some extent, and a lot of what they encounter in their adventures will be discoveries, will be things that are unfamiliar and strange and disconcerting and mysterious and wondrous, even though they themselves are fae. So I think if you read these books through that lens, they become even more useful for getting into that mindset. So this is very much a fish out of water story in that Richard Mayhew, I believe, bumps into and briefly rescues, I guess you could say, Fey princess who's fleeing from assassins. And her name is Door, and she can open anything. And just, you know, think about the possibilities of that for a moment. They end up running around London and kind of seeing different landmarks through, well, for Richard, new eyes and I guess Fey eyes. And it's just, I think it's kind of just a love letter to London through the lens of Neil Gaiman, who tends to make things vaguely creepy and uncanny. So,
Of all the urban fantasy we're doing here, I'd say it's the most urban.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like
it's hard to get more urban than London. And
it reminds me of like Toronto was some parts of Toronto or whatever. Like the city and New York has a huge mythology around this kind of thing too. I
yeah,
think just the underground city and the city that no one really sees but is beneath the city. And
large portions of this novel take place in the sewers.
yeah, like this could also work for a lot of other World of Darkness games, but I think it does fit Changeling the best out of them. But
Yeah, it has that sort of bombastic rump feel to it.
yeah,
And there's other, I mean, it was a tough call between really this one, Stardust, and Ocean at the End of the Lane, each of which I would say is particularly changeling, but in a different way. It kind of, each of those kind of touches on different aspects of what Changeling the Dreaming summons up when I think about it.
yeah, and I don't know if it fits our definition of book or not for the genre, but like his entire Sandman series. I mean, you have a
Yes, well,
character named
absolutely.
Dream of the Dream World. Like it's
Well, and there are
very
I mean, Titania's in it.
yeah, like it's
But
very
we'll
yeah,
save that for the graphic novels episode, which will happen because I've got thoughts on that as well.
excellent. So yes, I picked Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, another prolific author who wrote stories in common with like we could have done Good Omens, to some degree for Changeling, but yeah, Hogfather of the Terry Pratchett ones, maybe that's the best one fitting Changeling, part of his Discworld series, and it's essentially about the plot to kill not Santa Claus in this fantasy world of the Discworld, and it's put in place by essentially the incarnations of banality to kill him. It's talking a lot about belief and the importance of myth and the importance of not just looking at cold rationality, but looking at, you know, believing in the lies because the lies are true, but not in like a cheesy clap your hands way. Yeah, and going about the origins of myth, like it could things to say about in changeling terms about like who were these kith the Kithane, who were these kiths beforehand. That's another thing it could really get into. I think it could be a decent starting point if you haven't read the Discworld books before. Um, that's a series I wouldn't read in. I wouldn't necessarily suggest needs to be read in because he took a few books to get on his feet properly for the series, but I think this is pretty approachable for a first time thing. And there's been like a BBC sort of movie ish version that was actually pretty good, I thought.
Right on.
So yeah, what do you have next?
Well, I was going to say, I have read the first few Discworld novels. I almost said Discord novels. Join our Discord. And yeah, I mean, it's so like sacrilegious to say, but I almost didn't see what all the fuss was about.
No, that's not sacrilegious to say. That's what it is saying. If you're a Discord fan and saying you really liked the first Discord novel, is like
Discworld.
saying, "Oh, I
Discworld.
really liked playing first edition Magic, Changing the Dreaming from the core book."
Mm. Well,
Like,
I didn't hate that. I mean, like there's still he's one of those authors where just the jokes just keep coming and they just don't
yeah,
stop. And you, given how many novels he wrote, it's like he was a bottomless source of puns and satire and wit, and that
yeah,
comes through still in the first few novels. But from what I'm told, the later ones are where he really hits his stride. So
Oh yeah,
yeah.
the joke density goes down, but only because he's filling it with other things that are
Okay.
even that are better than jokes, if that makes sense. Like it is,
Yeah, for sure.
it becomes very much satire in in the best sense of it, and like reflecting of culture and philosophy and ethics discussions, very serious, well thought out ideas, but still in a bizarre comical world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you haven't read Hogfather and you've only read first few Discord, I think it's good to be on the reading list for
Discworld. Discworld.
Discworld. Did I say Discord as well?
You, it's hard to. We live in the era of Discord, which is
Yeah.
probably better than living in the era of Discworld or the actual Discworld itself. But
Yeah, thinking about it, also Discord's a terrible name for actually talking to each other and wanting the discussions to go well, isn't it?
I think that's the joke, isn't it? But,
Yeah.
yeah. So my next one is by Joanne M. Harris, who's probably best known for Chocolat, which I like to point to as an example of magic realism that doesn't get nearly enough attention. I mean, the film is popular, but she's also a writer, people. So, and this is the one I read most recently. I actually read this a few months ago. This is Honeycomb, and I really like. Well, I'll read the jacket description. Full of dreams and nightmares, Honeycomb is an entrancing mosaic novel of original interconnected fairy tales from best-selling author Joanne M. Harris and legendary artist Charles Vess in a collaboration that's been years in the making. So there are illustrations from Charles Vess, who's also very fairy literature inflected, very popular with fantasy authors, fairy fantasy authors, and they kind of pop up throughout the book. So the toy maker who wants to create the perfect wife, the princess whose heart is won by words, not actions, the tiny dog whose confidence far outweighs his size, and the sinister lacewing king who rules over the silken folk. Dark, gripping, and brilliantly imaginative, these interwoven magical stories of a war between kingdoms will soon have you in their thrall. I'd also, if we have time, I'd actually like to read the first one because they're very short. There's 100 of these little tales in total, and each one is like 2 to 3 pages. So they're quite short, but I think it'll give a good sense of the tone of the book. So the first one is called Nectar. When the 9 worlds were still very young, there were no stories. There was only Dream, the river that runs through all the worlds, reflecting the hearts and desires of the folk on its journey towards pandemonium. But by the side of that river there grew a flower with no name. It grew only there on the shore of Dream, between the dusty plains of death and the dark cliffs of damnation. Its petals were pale as young love, its leaves were like the starry sky, its roots were drenched with the dreams of the folk, and its scent was like honey and heartbreak. But no one saw the dream flower or caught its scent on the rapturous air. No living creature had ever seen the color of its petals or touched even one of its shining leaves, until one day a swarm of bees found its way into world below. They settled on the flower and fed, took nectar from its scented heart, and when at last they returned to their hive, they made honey from the nectar, and fed it to their young queen as she grew in her cradle of honeycomb. The honey was dark and scented and sweet. The queen in her golden citadel fed well on the nectar of dreams, and she grew in wisdom and beauty until at last she became the honeycomb queen, the very first of the silken folk whom some call the fairy, and some the first, and some the keepers of stories. Through this cross-pollination, the queen was born into the aspect of the people from whose dreams she had sprung. She could pass between their worlds. She could see into their hearts. She could use what she saw to spin glamours of the most marvelous kind, glamours that built worlds in the air, that opened every secret door, every chamber of the heart. And these were the very first stories. But from across the river Dream, the Halloween queen, half woman, half corpse, ruler of the kingdom of death, was watching the honeycomb queen from afar. From her dead eye she could see into the darkest dreams of the folk. From her living eye she could see everything in the 9 worlds. The touch of her living hand was a gift that no man had ever known. The touch of her withered hand brought death. Her kingdom was desert on every side. Nothing grew, nothing changed, and the only stories she ever heard were those that ended in death for everyone concerned. And as time passed, she grew jealous of the honeycomb queen and her stories, and she began to make plans to steal the lovely dream flower for herself. And so she crossed the river one night and went in search of the dream flower. For a time she stood watching it, breathing in its rapturous scent. Nothing was scented in her realm, nothing was soft or beautiful. A terrible loneliness welled up in her heart, and a single tear trickled down the living side of her ruined face. She stretched out a hand to pick the bloom, but in her haste the queen forgot to use her living hand, and touched the beautiful dream flower with her dead and withered fingers. At once the dream flower wilted and died. Its like has never been seen again. But its nectar remained with the honeycomb queen, and with the good industrious bees, passing from flower to flower, taking pollen back to the hive, and telling their tales wherever they went, for they too had fed from the nectar, and they were part of the river now, the river that runs through 9 worlds, taking with it the dreams of the folk and spinning them into stories. Some of those tales have stings attached, but then, of course, that's bees for you. Repeat 99 more times.
Yeah, that. Yeah, I haven't read this one either, but yeah, that's on this list. That makes
Yeah.
perfect.
So it's kind of like there's that mixed with these almost little fables that are like grim fairy tales, or Aesop's fables or whatever, where it's like the dog who wanted to be confident, those sorts of things. And then there are stories of humans touched by the fae. But what I like about this is it's kind of like there'll be this is the story of the girl who wanted to run away with the fairy prince, and then like 20 tales later she pops up and she's this ruined old woman who's bitter about never having the fairy prince having abandoned her and all this stuff. So the characters keep kind of popping up, and you see the consequences like way down the line, because obviously the fairy characters are immortal, and there's this whole she kind of creates her own mythos around it. So they're all kind of insectoid and have insect powers, and the 9 worlds aspect is a thing. It's also sort of vaguely set in time, because there will be these very high fantasy, far distant past kind of atmospheric things, and then there's like a train. So it kind of meshes different settings into its narrative. But it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I bought it. I was with a friend in the bookstore, and I saw it and picked it up, and she said, "You're buying that?" And I said, "Yeah." Just immediately, without even, I really did judge the book by its cover. So, and it was entirely worth it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that sounds like it worked out definitely.
Yeah. After that, we have.
So this one, don't know if for a little discussion on Sandman. I'm not sure if this counts by the genre, but I don't care. It's the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip series,
We'll count it.
which, yeah,
This was a listener suggestion, so we'll count it.
yes, and I think it definitely fits. Needs to be discussed in some episode about Changeling
Yeah.
because it is. There's nothing about fairies exactly. It is about, if you're not familiar with it, it's about a 6-year-old, very imaginative boy named Calvin and his chimerical companion Tiger named Hobbs, and their adventures and trouble he gets into. He keeps going through life by like picturing adult figures he doesn't like as horrible aliens or monsters or various other opponents to fight against. He has, you know, plays with like a cardboard box as a time machine or spaceship or
Transmogrifier.
yeah, transform. Just
Calvin is a knocker. I mean, I think we can agree. Calvin is a knocker.
yeah, or just a really inspired dreamer. Like it's,
Yeah.
I think he's the art. Like his kind of thing's the argument for maybe dreamers should have more access to the chimerical world, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. But yeah,
It's interesting. So you could almost think of him as like Knocker Kinane, because this is deep cut. His dad in the comic is a patent attorney, which strikes me as like something a knocker would be once they become undone.
yeah, where he's yeah, his dad went through the frigate. His dad's not banal, but his dad's definitely.
No longer a changeling. So,
But you can tell it's almost like the mist's part sometimes for him,
yeah, yeah.
as opposed to his mom, who's very nice but really seems less likely to get it.
But she has her moments.
Yes, his teacher's just. I wouldn't even say an autumn person, but he sees her that way.
Mm-hmm.
I have a bunch of collections that I've shown my kids and stuff. It's just
It broke my heart a little bit when you said, if you're not familiar with Calvin and Hobbes. I almost wanted to say, who's not familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, but I recognize that Not
When did
everybody
it stop being in the newspapers? When did
just
Yeah, last appearance was 1990, the same year Changing the Dreaming core book came out,
no. Actually, that's about,
first
it
edition.
was December 31st, 1995, because I remember them printing the line in the newspaper that said it would stop on that day, and my whole family was bummed.
Yeah. So it's like when I was in high school, a lot of my friends were still reading it,
Oh,
and
yeah.
including people who would not be playing Changeling the Dreaming, but or
Yeah.
any role playing game. But
I would even hazard that its creator, Bill Watterson, is is changeling-ish in a way, because one of his sort of things was that he very adamantly refused to kind of cave to the wishes of the publishers or the newspapers to kind of do a traditional four-panel structure or license merchandise or any of
oh
that.
yeah,
And he stopped when he felt he was done. He didn't drag it out and suck all the life out of it. And I
it's
really
the anti
admire that.
Garfield. Yeah,
Exactly, yeah. And I admire that a lot.
yeah, no, yeah. If in Changeling you had Bill Watterson being a changeling, make total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have some? Do you have another one?
Yeah, we kind of decided, we said 10 books for inspiration, but the hell with it. We're doing 13, so that just
Yeah,
makes more sense.
I have a few honorable mentions,
Yeah.
brief
I'll do
mentions.
two and then, well, I'll do
Yeah,
one, you do one, I'll do one, and then
yeah. Well,
um
I've thought of three, honestly,
oh,
since we've discussed
we
it, that
we are
need to be mentioned, like
I think it's
briefly.
clear. I think it's clear that we are going to do another installment of this.
Yeah.
So,
So we did 10 deep dives, and we'll do some honorable mentions.
yeah.
I think that's fair.
Well, the first is, and this is from, again, listener suggestions, is the collected fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. Pretty obvious because they've informed so much of pop culture to the point that you almost don't even need to have read them, because
Hmm.
a certain entertainment company based in Florida and or California, I guess, has made their entire line of movies based off of them. And there are many TV shows that and graphic novels, again, or comic series that kind of spin off of them. So things like Cinderella and Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin, they're just kind of embedded in the, I guess you would say, the Western cultural
Yeah, the
folklore mind.
zeitgeist. But by
Yeah.
saying that, you just now I have four. But go on.
Well,
But
well, that's
yeah,
so that's
yeah.
honorable mention one. So what's your
Yeah,
honorable
I
mention
think
one?
well, I think we could throw in with that. There's a lot of other folklore, just books of folklore you can pull into,
Yeah.
as well as things like Hans Christian Andersen and all that stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But okay, the one I so Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, especially that, especially if you ignore the movie and go with the book interpretation, where she's actually in this other world and whatnot. I mean, that's something I'd imagine most people here have read, but even more so than the Calvin and Hobbes. That just seems
Yeah.
you'd have to be familiar, or at least seen the movies or something. But yeah, that's another definite inspiration for Changeling, including some of the darker aspects.
And the more madcap.
Yeah, yeah, the dreaming depiction. Like you go in the, I'd say it's like a far dreaming adventure.
Mm. Although, so I don't know if you're familiar with the show QI. I'm a fan of it. But I remember one segment where they talk about how a possible interpretation of that book is as a deeply bitter satire of developments in British thinking about mathematics of the time,
Yes.
which is a really interesting and really banal way to kind of frame it.
Well,
But
you get
happily,
both
something,
that and Lovecraft from the
yeah,
same stuff,
yeah.
which is like what? But
Cases maybe where people were more inspired by the books and kind of took them and ran with them than their authors may have originally intended. So
I don't know. I don't think having read them that it's just a set. Like I can see maybe it was inspired by for being this is weird, but I don't think that was the point of these books. I would argue.
maybe it
But
started as a satire and then a changeling got hold of him and just used him
yes,
until it became something greater.
yes, that could be it.
The last one that I want to honorably mention is Midnight Never Come by Marie Brennan, which is the first in a series called the Onyx Court series. I've only read the first one, so I don't know much about the others. And this is kind of a cheat because rather than being, I mean, it is an inspiration for Changeling games, but very specifically, it was also inspired by Changeling. And Marie
Mm-hmm.
Brennan has talked about how it's essentially an adaptation of the Changeling Chronicle that she ran, and kind of one part of it evolved into this novel, which then evolved into a series. But it's set in Elizabethan England, so if you're looking to do a historical Changeling game, this is a good resource to kind of check out. And it's very, I mean, I enjoyed it. I used to read it. I remember reading it on the train to work and just kind of sitting and being like, "Oh, I don't want to get off the subway. I want to keep reading."
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a bit. It's not exactly Changeling. Like she takes the setting and makes it her own, but you can very clearly see the roots of it.
Yeah, and I just had two more briefly mentioning that just
Do you want to
have to.
throw titles to like foreshadow
Yeah,
next time? Okay.
well, it's just two things that have to be on here is Peter Pan
Yep.
and the Oz series.
Yep.
Like, don't need to say anything more. Just those are also on the list. They have to be.
I can throw a few out there as well. I mean, I'm looking at my bookshelf as I sit here and thinking, "Oh yeah, that one." But
But those are ones that I don't even think we need to. We just need to
yeah, this is like, "Oh, of course."
remind our
Yeah.
listeners to think about those stories
Right.
when looking at Changeling. They don't even.
Right. Or like any book of Arthurian lore.
Yes.
Yeah.
We do
So,
have a listener question.
yes, from Zart.
Yes, who's a friend of mine actually from years ago.
Huzzah.
Though I never actually ran a Changeling game with him or played in a Changeling game with him.
It's never too late.
Yes, I think he did play a werewolf when I played a Changeling in a crossover game, though. It's close enough. And he said, "Do you suppose there is something intrinsic to reading in the medium of books that is especially well suited to the kind of adventurous and imaginative spirit at the heart of Changeling?"
So, I kind of alluded to this in, in that channel on the Discord, but in, among the many hats that I wear, one of them is media studies lecturer for undergrads sometimes. And this is a topic that we have specifically touched upon. So I do have thoughts about this that I want to try and limit to like a brief soundbite. So, because otherwise,
Okay.
I mean, I could just pull out my lecture notes, but I don't think anyone wants to sit here all
I,
day for that.
I
So
have brief thoughts about it, but maybe we'll
go
do.
for it.
Okay. I disagree. I
Okay.
don't think it does. I think it's a great medium for Changeling, but for a creative storytelling medium, I think any creative storytelling medium is really great for Changeling. I don't think I could pick out one that's actually better than the others. Maybe I could come up with something that's inappropriate, but there's so many others that also fit. Like we could do movie examples, we can do TV examples, we could do also. You're talking about you said the graphic novels count differently. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
there's so many other things. There's storytelling in the oral tradition, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so many other types of storytelling that also is great inspiration for Changeling. I wouldn't say. I think it's a different one, a unique one. Each of them are, but I don't think it's particularly Changeling appropriate.
Mm-hmm. I half agree with the suggestion, or I half suppose. And the reason I say that is, on the one hand, one of the things about books, physical books in particular, that distinguishes them from something like a film or a TV show is the level of control, for lack of a better term, that the reader has over their consumption of the medium. You choose when to turn the page. You can go back and decide which part you want to reread or remind yourself of something. And by having that, it does kind of draw the reader in and engage them a little bit more, I would say. That being said, I don't think everyone has the same experience with a medium. Part of that is cultural, part of that is personal experience, and part of that is discourse surrounding the medium. So the way that we feel about books and the way that we feel we should engage with books informs how we actually do. And it's a complex and subtle process, so I don't know that one can make a hard blanket statement like yes or no about it.
Yeah,
This is a very academic kind of answer. Like it's always the
yeah.
fuzzy
Well,
boundaries.
like
But
my subjective experience for I have a thick fiction book that I get engrossed into, and I have a binging streaming media season coming out that I get into. They're very similar for me.
mm,
So
they're not for me necessarily. That's
yeah.
but that's a case in point that it's different for everybody.
Hmm.
And both of those can engross me, but the way that I get engrossed in a book is much different than the way I get engrossed in television. And part of it, again, another aspect of books that distinguishes them is you're the one who has to decide how the voices sound and often what the characters look like and what the places being described look like. That process of visualization, that takes a lot more active participation
Hmm.
from the reader. Now, I don't know necessarily that that makes someone more adventurous or more imaginative, and I don't think that the medium itself determines that, because there are some boring ass fantasy novels out there and there are some wonderfully inventive cartoons out there, and I would happily
Yeah.
take the cartoon for Changeling over the lengthy novel that's a chore to read. But when focusing just on the form itself, I think each one has advantages that it helps to be aware of for yourself as a consumer of media.
And that's what I would say. Yeah, I wouldn't say it is all like, yeah. When I said that, it's more like the emotional subjective experience is similar for me, or the
Mm-hmm.
engrossed and lost in time for hours, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to, yeah, what it's actually doing is different. I agree,
Yeah.
and but they're all good for Changeling. Like, I'd say the best inspiration for Changeling is playing Let's Pretend in kindergarten or something like that. That
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of. If I had to give advice to somebody on what media to consume to inform their experience of Changeling, it would just be consume as wide a variety as possible and find what sticks best. Chances are lots of
yes.
things will stick well in different ways, and that depth gives you a lot of dynamics to work with, which I think is
Hmm.
very important for Changeling. Maybe more so than, well, maybe not more than Mage, but equal to Mage.
The one thing I'd say with Changeling is more than Mage. If you were to contrast Changeling and Mage, it's the how engrossed are you? Like, for Changeling, I would want you're swept away, especially if it's a surreal wild ride or contrasting between very mundane and very surreal, or those kind of things, right?
Mhm.
And Mage maybe is more works better if you're inspiring it like something more heady
Hmm.
and intellectual. Like, if we were to do this book for 10 books for Mage, I would have several nonfiction titles on the
Yeah.
book list. And putting that for Changeling just would seem bizarre to me. But
I mean, I'm happy to do a spin-off if Terry from Mage the Podcast
yes,
wants.
if you
But
wanted. Yeah,
Terry, if you're
so
listening,
yeah, I do have several nonfiction books that are on my list, inspiration for Mage, but and fiction books. But
well, yeah, I mean, yeah, like novels too and stuff.
yeah,
Anyway, so that's my very brief media studies aspect response to that question. But it's a good question, and I'm glad that people are asking it because, frankly, I think people don't, take enough chances on the media they consume anymore. We live in
hmm
an era where things are suggested for you or recommended for you, or access can change on a moment's notice. And I really miss just sitting in a bookstore for hours discovering things. That was so helpful to me as a youth, or sitting in the
well,
library and taking things home without knowing what they were going to be like.
there's an ironic. Maybe we're just two old people. Mrs. Grump talk now.
But it's not like those things have disappeared entirely. They're
No,
still
no, but the
there. It's
difference
just they're,
is the difference is now and then. I don't think it's just how old we are. I think it's times have changed.
yeah, of course.
Is it's almost like the lack of boredom has made banality easier.
Yeah. There are more outlets for connection and distraction than there used to
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
So,
Like, if it was like my kids are not voracious readers, and I'm going like, well, their personality is similar to mine, and then I'm like, oh, they have the internet.
right,
That's why I sat down and read books. There was nothing good on TV, and I
right.
couldn't go hang out with my friends. What else do you do? Like,
Well, to be fair to like TV and film, there's also much better TV out there
oh yeah,
nowadays.
but it's also
So
accessible. I could
right,
flop
right,
on how many things and watch it at any given
right.
time.
All
It,
of these
it,
books we talked about did not exist in television form when we were young, for the most part.
yes,
So now there is stuff like that, and it's wonderful. So we can probably do a 10 TV shows episode as well.
yeah, but
So
even then, I couldn't necessarily just go watch if we did a list of TV shows that existed before 1995 or something. Like, it's not like I could just go and could have watched them then, even if they were all great inspirations for
right,
Changeling.
if you missed them, that was it.
Yep.
Like Deep Space Nine.
Yes,
Circling
the
back,
most
circling back
changeling
again.
science fiction series ever, probably.
Yes. Anyway,
It even has changelings in it.
it's true. In any case,
Anyway, we'll do our deep dive on Deep Space Nine. Will be a future episode.
well, necessarily it will be. So
Yes. So yeah, that's this has been Changeling the podcast. You can reach us at our website at changelingthepodcast.com. You can email us at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. What's our Twitter handle again?
at Changelingcast. And our Discord is linked at the bottom of the show notes on each of the pages of the website.
We also have a Facebook page if you want to check that out as well.
You can also just shout into the empty air and see if it gets our attention. You never know.
Yes. We have had some actually nice people reaching out to us through various means recently, and I just want to say thank you to them. I didn't get the permission to name them, but yeah, thank you so much. Like, this has been keeping at least my spirits up for the keeping this going. So
Same. Yeah, please
yeah.
reach out. Please let us know, what you think, if there's stuff you like.
So once again, I've been Josh.
I've been, as always, Puka.
And make sure when you go on these deep dreaming adventures through all this wonderful literary reading that you actually take the silver path back and don't fall to bedlam.
And always remember where your towel is.
There's another one!
Sorry.
If you like our show and want to give us some more support so that we can continue bringing you Changeling the Dreaming related content, please feel free to sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/changelingthepodcast, where you'll receive patron-only content in exchange, such as a shout-out at the end of each episode. This week, we're shouting out our first two supporters, Sanchiger and Seija. Thank you!
Here come the outtakes. I also have affection for this book because it's signed, so I'll admit I've cooled on Neil Gaiman over the years. I mean, Neil Gaiman was like my idol back in the day. Just I wanted to be a writer like Neil Gaiman. It was him and Tolkien. Those were like the two, and Le Guin. Those were the three. But I think over time, I'd like to think I've branched out a little bit, but I still get like the glamour hit when I pick up one of these
cool
books.
of him does not mean you don't like him. It just means you have
No, I still adore his work. I mean, so anyway.
Yeah. My mom got I remember when I was like an early teenager, my mom went to a signing of his at a comic shop. Nice. And she had made like a death doll.
Oh.
And got him to sign, or maybe it was a dream doll, I can't remember. Anyway, got him to sign that. That was the...
I believe this signing is where I saw him. He read and Amanda Palmer performed, and this was kind of briefly before they went public with their romance. But leaving aside all of that stuff, it was a wonderful experience. It was also in Dublin, and because we went on a family vacation, and I had been at work reading LiveJournal, I think, and saw he was talking about how his flight was delayed or something, and he was at the Philadelphia airport, and I'm frantically texting my parents like, do you see a guy with like messy black hair and a black leather jacket and sunglasses maybe? And I was like, yeah, I think we might have. He kind of like, he looked really grumpy and got on before everyone else. I was like, that was probably him. But then we met him at the bookstore, so it was fine. So
he's always been super nice when I see him, like when I see him in person.
Well, his flight had been delayed or whatever, so I'm sure it was a mood. But
I think him grumpy is still better than a lot of people. Yeah.
Anyway, moving on.